Bold, audacious, well-timed, and precisely targeted. It was almost the perfect scam. But in early 1998, it all began to unravel because Jamie Lopez, who had no knowledge of it, was frustrated. The Brazilian bank he worked for, Banco Noreste, was in the process of being acquired by Spain's largest bank, Banco Santander, for a whopping $500 million, and he had a part in making sure it happened. But he had not been able to get all the information he needed to do his job, particularly information from the overseas accounts, which were under the bank's Director of Overseas Accounts, Nelson Sakaguchi. The board of the bank had ordered Sakaguchi to hand over to Lopez all the documentation relating to 3 years' business of its operations based in the Cayman Islands. But Sakaguchi had been stalling. On this day in February 1998, Jamie Lopez had it. When he approached Sakaguchi for the documentation, Sakaguchi began to formulate yet another excuse. Lopez lost his cool. Grabbing Sakaguchi by the collar, he screamed at him, "Look, no more stories. I want to see the figures and I want to see them now." The famously stoic Nelson Sakaguchi, comfortable in ministerial meetings with officials from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, famous for being cold and, as peers put it, hyper-efficient, finally had his defenses brought down. In a word, the 14-year veteran banker was rattled. He mumbled, "I've always had gambling in my blood." But he soon showed the figures. And they would begin an international fraud and money laundering investigation into the third biggest fraud in banking history, with trails from Brazil to Nigeria, the United States to the Cayman Islands, United Kingdom to Hong Kong, and, of course, Switzerland, with the bank hiring the services of a Miami lawyer, Bill Ritchie, who famously said, "I will not accept a case if it's less than $5 million. It's not worth the chase." I am Emmanuel Nwude, and this is a very Nigerian crime. Long before emails and cloud storage, fax machines were the way companies and individuals sent documents to each other. One day in 1995, Nelson Sakaguchi received a fax with letterhead from the Nigerian Ministry of Aviation. The letter was signed by a Tafida Williams, purportedly the Director of Budget and Planning at the ministry. It stated that Banco Noreste had come highly recommended by a Nigerian client of the bank's, who was well known to Sakaguchi, and the client had intimated to the ministry that Banco Noreste might be interested in a new investment opportunity. Mr. Williams explained that the government of Nigeria had moved to the new capital Abuja in 1991, and the time had come to build a brand new international airport in collaboration with external investors in order to service the fastest growing city in Africa's most populous country. The rates of return would, of course, be highly lucrative, and is it something that Banco Noreste might be interested in? Of course, Nelson Sakaguchi, the shrewd banker and investor, was interested in exploring the possibility. What Sakaguchi didn't know at the time was that Tafida Williams was not the Director of Budget and Planning at the Ministry of Aviation. In fact, he didn't exist. Williams was a fictitious character created by a group of fraudsters who had targeted Sakaguchi for a multi-million-dollar scam, and the fraudulent fax was just the first stage in their plan. Nelson Sakaguchi responded to the fax, and from there, the scammers began to rope him in. First, they arranged to meet with him in London. Upon arrival, he was met at the airport and whisked in an expensive limousine to a high-end hotel. There, he was met by a slightly heavy-set man who introduced himself as the governor of Nigeria's central bank, Paul Ogwuma, even handing over a business card to that effect. Other accomplices at the meeting introduced themselves as the deputy governor of the CBN, the deputy governor's wife, and a senior representative of Nigeria's Ministry of Aviation. In those days before LinkedIn and Facebook profiles, Sakaguchi didn't have many ways to verify their identities, but the reputation of the real CBN governor in the world of international finance was huge and helped seal the deal for Sakaguchi. So much so that he parted with $35,000 cash to the fraudsters before leaving London, based on a promise to receive $39 million in return soon. Of course, the $39 million never appeared. Sakaguchi had been hooked, made his first payment, and was now in the hands of a group of scammers who knew what they were doing. Emmanuel Nwude, the imposter who impersonated the CBN Governor Paul Oguma, was a real banker, a director at Union Bank of Nigeria, one of the country's largest and most well-known banks. Nwude's accomplice, Christian Ikechukwu Anajemba, had played the role of the Central Bank's deputy governor, and his real-life wife, Amaka Anajemba, stood in as his wife in the impersonation. The rest of the gang included Emmanuel Ofolue, Nzeribe Okoli, and Obum Osakwe. Despite being a top banker, Emmanuel Nwude hadn't studied neither banking nor finance. In fact, he hadn't studied at all. Nwude was a product of the streets. He was business savvy, street smart, and fearless, traits which saw him rise the corporate ladder in what should have been an inspirational story. But greed had come to consume him, with one lawyer in the case even referring to Nwude as a thug. And now he had used his street smarts to target Nelson Sakaguchi as a mark, used his knowledge of the banking industry to successfully impersonate Nigerian CBN governor, and continued to manipulate Sakaguchi into continually sending payments to his gang. From 1995 to 1998, Sakaguchi sent a number of payments in increments of less than $6 million per transfer through a sophisticated network of banks to Emmanuel Nwude and his gang. He did it this way because, as the director of overseas operations, he was authorized to make transfers below $6 million, but for anything above that, he would have to seek permission from his superiors. The payments were made via circuitous routes through banks in the United States, United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Hong Kong. Asset recovery lawyers for Banco Noreste would later find that $70 million went in and out of Lloyd's Bank in 1 year, and another $50 million through Citibank in a period of just months. In Nigeria alone, 17 different banks were used to shuffle the money around and hide the trail. And yet, it appears that not a single bank, local or international, stopped to question these payments. Rather, they appear to have been eager, if unwitting, facilitators for Nwude and his gang. The fraudsters, meanwhile, were swimming in riches. They built mansions in Nigeria, purchased real estate in Redondo and Huntington Beaches in California, and invested in a dizzying array of properties in North London. They were so good at it that Keith Oliver, the London assets recovery lawyer, later remarked, "It made our job easier when it came to getting the money back. The houses had increased in value so much that we were able to cover a good deal more than we had at first anticipated." In just 3 years, Nelson Sakaguchi sent a total of $242 million, or in today's money, $413 million, to the fraudsters, an amount which was just over half of Banco Noreste's capital at the time. But there's one question which has baffled friends, family, and even investigators. Why would Nelson Sakaguchi, who had faithfully served Banco Noreste for 14 years, fall for such a scam? And then, when the promised payments never arrived, why did he keep sending even more money to Nwude and his gang? Was he purely an innocent victim? Or was there more to this seeming gullibility than meets the eye? Some prosecutors have alleged that Nwude and his gang had promised Sakaguchi up to $10 million in kickbacks once returns from the fictitious airport were realized. There is some merit to this theory. After all, Sakaguchi was highly experienced and shouldn't be expected to fall for such a scam unless he was to receive something at the end of it, right? Secondly, the fact that he kept moving the money in hidden ways and being sneaky about payments also appears to suggest he was expecting to get a share of the profits before returning the money to the bank. But, perhaps, the right explanation is the simplest one. Nelson Sakaguchi was probably just afraid. You see, before the fraud was uncovered, Sakaguchi, probably in a state of panic and despair, sought advice from one Maria Rodriguez, a priestess of Macumbe, a kind of religion that mixes elements from African traditional religions and Christianity. He first paid $10 million to Maria Rodriguez to purchase 120,000 white doves, which would be released so that his problems would, fly away. Then, when that didn't work, he paid another $10 million to the same priestess to purchase 120,000 black doves, this time for another ritual. After the fraud was discovered, Banco Noreste's owners were forced to pay off the missing money from their share of the acquisition money by Spain's Banco Santander, just to make the deal go through. Naturally, they wanted to get their money back. And so they hired asset recovery lawyers and alerted authorities to the fraud. However, they faced significant hurdles. Because of the multiple jurisdictions involved, the impersonations by Nwude and his accomplices, and the multiple diversions created in the transactions, they couldn't easily identify who the fraudsters really were, let alone go after them. So they started small. They filed a criminal complaint in Geneva against an account there that had received $5 million from Noreste's accounts. The amount itself wasn't much in comparison, but once the account was frozen, the court demanded all records for that account, and they were then able to see all the other accounts it had interacted with. After that, they continued to pursue accounts in multiple countries that had strong banking laws, including banks in London. At that point, they were able to pressure Nigerian banks for full disclosure, and the banks, fearing that their accounts in British banks could be closed or frozen if they were seen to be harboring fraudsters, complied with requests. When Sakaguchi took a flight to New York, he was arrested at JFK International Airport based on an arrest warrant from Switzerland, where he was accused of money laundering to the tune of $242 million. The US extradited Sakaguchi to Switzerland, where he was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 30 months in prison for laundering money that Nwude and his accomplices eventually stole from him. The Nigerian fraud ring wasn't prosecuted under the regime of military dictator General Sani Abacha. It wasn't until the return of democracy in 1999 that President Olusegun Obasanjo asked the National Assembly to create the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission and confirmed the EFCC's first chairman, Nuhu Ribadu, in 2003 that the Nigerian authorities finally took up the case. By 2004, Emmanuel Nwude and most of his gang were arraigned in an Abuja High Court on 86 counts of fraudulently seeking advance fees and 15 counts of bribery. One gang member who could not be charged was Christian Anajemba, who had been killed in a suspicious road accident that many believed to be an assassination. His wife and accomplice, Amaka Anajemba, was quick to plead guilty and throw herself at the mercy of the court. In 2005, she was sentenced to 2.5 years imprisonment and ordered to pay back $25.5 million. But Nwude isn't the type to go down without a fight. At an early stage of proceedings, the presiding judge was forced to caution everyone in open court after rumors within the courthouse that some judicial officers were accepting bribes to influence the case in favor of the defendants. Nwude then attempted to bribe the EFCC chairman himself, offering Ribadu $75,000, but the chairman refused the bribe, and Nwude was subsequently charged for that also. It was only when Nelson Sakaguchi began testifying in court that Emmanuel Nwude and his other accomplices finally accepted the game was up. They changed their pleas to guilty. Nwude was sentenced to 5 sentences of 5 years each and ordered to pay a $10 million fine to the federal government. Strangely, his 5 sentences were each to run concurrently, which meant that he could be released from prison in 3 years. In fact, he was released the very next year, 2006. Shortly after his release, Nwude promptly sued the Nigerian federal government to recover funds he claims were legitimately his prior to the bank owner-arrested fraud. He's known to have recovered at least $167 million. But Nwude's criminal career was far from over. In 2016, he was arrested yet again and remanded in prison custody, this time for allegedly being the mastermind of an attack by about 200 men on the community of Ukwo in Anambra State over a land dispute. An attack which left 4 policemen and a security guard at a construction site dead. As for Sakaguchi, while imprisoned in Switzerland, he worked in the kitchens there when he was able to send between $400 and $450 a month home to his wife and children. After being released, he sold off his high-end condominium, farm in the countryside, and cars in order to pay off debts and school fees for his children. He bought a truck and went into producing and selling vegetables, but community backlash soon put a stop to that. He then became a chemical salesman, but that didn't work out either. At one point, Sakaguchi applied to be an English teacher but was rejected. He began to work the odd consulting job while making do with his retirement fund and his wife's income from Portuguese and math classes. But the Brazilian government wasn't quite done with him. They charged him with fraud and money laundering, and he was eventually sentenced to 6 years in prison there. As for the banks involved in the money laundering, many of them are said to have paid fines to government authorities in return for not being prosecuted for their negligence in allowing such a large fraud to go unnoticed for so long. As for the construction of Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport in Abuja, it began in the year 2000 and was completed in 2002, without the involvement of Nwude or Sakaguchi. In this, the third biggest banking fraud in history, there were no complete winners, only losers. For more Nigerian crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Remember, stay safe and stay blessed.